Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
Brothers and sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals, let me tell you why I give that invitation. I don't care who you are. I don't care about your race, your color, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, your politics. None of that means anything to me. What I'm saying is if you are watching, I welcome you. And I don't have any way of knowing whether one person is watching, 1,000 people are watching, or 0 people are watching. When I agree to do something, the burden, if you want to call it that, is on me to do what I promised to do, regardless of what anybody else has done. And this principle has served me very well because I do not get discouraged when I don't have a lot of company along with me when I'm doing something that is difficult or controversial. As some people know, maybe a lot of people, I wish all knew, March is Women's History Month. And I could not let this month go by without commenting on it. You know they have what they call Black History Month. They used to call it Negro History. Women have played a very, very important role in everything that has happened in the history of the world. No matter how great a man is, whether it's Jesus Christ, Julius Caesar, or anybody else, they wouldn't be here had it not been for a woman. So that's why the Native Americans refer to the earth as Mother Earth. She gives birth to everything living, and in the natural world, non-living. Some people, however, attribute or ascribe to what we call inanimate objects a soul or a spirit or an essence which is unseen, unheard, unfelt, but goes beyond just the physical, corporeal form of that object. Let me get started. White men in America control everything, always have. They feel like they always will. Well, in the retail industry, women had made strides during the times when people were pushing for what they call affirmative action. As women CEOs, chief executive officers, leave through retirement or whatever, they're being replaced by men. And I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs from an article just a few days old. Over the past 12 months, 39 retail CEOs, 12 women and 27 men, have been replaced, and in the process, 6 fewer women were appointed as replacements. That was said by John Long, Korn Kerry's North America retail sector leader based in Dallas. Quote, "It's hard to take a 12-month view and be declarative, but women are losing ground," Long said. "The recent experience is worth watching. While retail CEO tenure averaged almost 6 years overall, women's spans were almost 2.5 years shorter than men's," Long said. "We have to look at a longer time horizon. When white men are forced, one way or the other, to stop being so unjust, they're like a crouching beast, crouched, muscles bunched and tensed, ready to spring at the least opportunity to turn the clock back to where it was and where they feel comfortable. That's happening in the retail sector, and these CEOs primarily are white women. So the more things change, the more they remain or become the same. Here I have before me a copy of a resolution when I was in the legislature. It was enacted March 8th, 2018. it was numbered Legislative Resolution 341. 1. Whereas March is Women's History Month and is a time to celebrate the significant contributions women of all races, ethnicities, and backgrounds have made to the world. And whereas women play a critical role in the vitality and diversity of our communities and are essential to ensuring Nebraska is well represented, and whereas while the 20th century was a pivotal time of growth for women entering politics, women remain underrepresented in male-dominated fields, thus providing opportunities to support women in public office is imperative. And 4, whereas recognizing women in public office will bring awareness to the fundamental necessity of their work and will inspire other young people to serve their communities. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the members of the 105th Legislature of Nebraska, second session, that the legislature recognizes March 19th, 2018 as Celebrating Women in Public Office Day and calls upon the people of this state to unite in supporting the success of women in public office. Now, you can subtract, 18 from 24. In the 6 years since this resolution passed, would you say that a substantial or remarkable number of women have influxed into politics, whether at the city, county, state, or federal level? People call me a pessimist. I say a realist. I say no. Women are still on the downslope everywhere. Every man should consider this. We should love women because each one of us was born in bed with a woman. And beyond that, as Sojourner Truth pointed out to Frederick Douglass when there was a debate of some kind or other going on, God and a woman produced your Jesus Christ. A man had nothing whatsoever to do with it. You can give all of the rational arguments, but if white men were rational, we wouldn't have the discrimination that they trigger against especially black people of both sexes. But everybody they can take advantage of, they will. Is this every white man? Of course not. But it has to be a substantial number for the entire nation to be infected with this evil. Now, I'm going to read something that might be strange to hear coming from me because of the misperception people have about me. I always said in the legislature, I am the defender of the downtrodden. I don't care about race, religion, sexual orientation. And there seems to be so much concern about what happens in between people's legs that I told my colleagues in the legislature, you need to get off crotch watch and give your mind to something a little higher up on the anatomy, the heart and the mind. Did it do any good? Is a pig's rump beef? Abigail Adams lived to be 74 years old. She was born in 1818 and died 74 years later. She was born in 1744. Now, this woman was married to the second president of the United States, John Adams, and she was known for writing letters, and there have been gatherings and collections of them. I'm just going to read a few things. Writing to her husband, in the new code of laws which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That was written to John, March 31st, 1776. May of that same month, of that same year, writing to John Adams, whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. But you must remember that arbitrary is, like most other things which are very hard, very liable to be broken. And notwithstanding all your wise laws and maxims, we have it in our power not only to free ourselves, but to subdue our masters, and without violence throw both your natural and legal authority at our feet. May 7th, 1776. Deliver me from your cold, phlegmatic preachers, politicians, friends, lovers, and husbands. In other words, no matter what label a man wears, they're all cut from the same cloth. That was written to Johnny August 5th of 1776. Then, the next letter that I'll read from, if we mean to have heroes, statesmen, and philosophers, we should have learned women. If much depends, as is allowed, upon the early education of youth, and the first principles which are instilled take the deepest root, great benefit must arise from literary accomplishments in women. In other words, wake up and smell the flowers. That was written August 14th, 1776. And this, it is really mortifying, sir, when a woman possessed of a common share of understanding considers the difference of education between the male and female, even in those families where education is attended to. Nay, why should your sex wish for such a disparity in those whom they one day intend for companions and associates? Pardon me, sir, if I cannot help sometimes suspecting that this neglect arises in some measure from an ungenerous jealousy of rivals near the throne. That was not written to John Adams. That was written to John Thaxter. I'm not going to tell you who he was. Check it out. Now here she is writing to John. I regret the trifling, narrow, contracted education of females of my own country. I thought I should read that in Women's History Month. And remember what I read? The little rhyme that I wrote? Why was March, the month for women's history, selected? When the truth's revealed, it may disarm. As in many instances, it may prove unexpected. Rearranged, its letters spell out charm. I'm fascinated by language, fascinated by words and numbers. I'm not a mathematician. I do a bit of writing, but I read the works of men like Edgar Allan Poe, Jonathan Swift. Richard Wright was a black man who wrote Black Boy, and just any number of people. They take words, and those words sometimes, to me, will come off the page and assume, in my mind, a shape of their own, and we converse. I don't borrow books from people because I talk back to the author. I write in the margins of all of the books that I have. I underline. I have a conversation. I'm not one who absorbs like a sponge. and become whatever it was that was absorbed without being changed. I'm constantly learning. I want to know everything, but obviously I cannot. So I read a lot. I count sometimes the letters in individual words that are pronounced the same but are spelled differently. English is one of the most difficult languages to learn because that group of letters, O-U-G-H, in the word enough, it sounds like uff. But in that rockabye baby, when the bow breaks, that's B-O-U-G-H, but it's not pronounced buff, it's pronounced bow. So even though A, and there the O-U-G-H is pronounced like a long O. O, ow, uff, from the same grouping of letters. The only difference is the first letter preceding them. How difficult would a language like that be for somebody whose language it is not? English is one of the most difficult languages to learn. Excuse me. Now I'm going to read something that goes to efforts I put forth to maintain a dignity for the legislature as an institution. I wanted us as lawmakers to respect the law. As a member of the legislature, I would tell them, this is not my legislature, it's yours, but I respect it more than you do. I came here because the people in my community wanted me to be here. From the time I was in my late teens, black adults came to me for advice and assistance. I would appear before the city council. I would go down to the police station when people had been arrested. You might call it foolhardy, but I just didn't have any fear. But I was very disgusted and upset with the things that were done to black people, and it didn't matter whether we had a lot of money, whether we had education, whether we were threadbare or wore the finest threads. If you were black, get back. And the irony was that I knew people as pale as those who were called white, but they were referred to by the N-word and treated like the so-called N's were treated and were referred to as Negroes. So some of that was confusing to me when I was younger. So one thing that allowed me to remain sane was to come to the conclusion that grown people are crazy. And what I had to do was figure out for myself what made sense. But if I wanted to survive and not get, as old people would say, knocked into the middle of next week, having been dealt with all their lives, and their forebears having been dealt with all their lives, violence inflicted by white people on them on whim. Those who are beaten seem to develop a desire, an urge, or an inclination to become beaters. So self-preservation was inbred in me early in life. I knew, although this is not the way I formulated it, I heard this expression much later, but I remembered it, a still tongue leads to a wise head. But for me, a still tongue leads to an unbroken head. So if I didn't want to get, as older people say, knocked into the middle of next week, I knew when to keep a still tongue in my head. But as I grew up, I didn't have the fear that some had, because I thought some things just shouldn't happen to anybody, and certainly not us, when we hadn't done anything to anybody. The idea of being inferior, that word was not known to me, but I experienced as a child in grade school what being in that status meant when the white teacher, whom my parents taught me to respect, read Little Black Sambo, that vicious tale that demeaned, degraded, and disparaged us, read to me and the class. I was the only black child there, by a white teacher my parents taught me to respect, and was laughed at. I didn't cry, but I felt deserted, and this teacher knew that I couldn't fight back, that I didn't know how to fight back, and she did that to me, and I'll never forget it. And I think that may be, old people had an expression, that child is marked. It marked me. And maybe that's what gave me a kind of determination that other people don't have. I can think back, and I don't feel the pain the same way now that I did as a child, but I'll never forget it. And I don't want any child, I don't care whose child it is, to have that feeling that I had, no matter what the source of it would be. For some reason, little children are now attracted to me, and a guy had written an article and said, Chambers is a magnet for young people. In the past, I've mentioned photographs that people wanted me to take with their children, so I'm not going through that again. But anybody who I see abusing children is somebody who bears watching. But among the least, the last, and the lost, who are my constituency, the children play a prominent role. Jesus had a way with children, and his disciples were like most grown people are now when it comes to who's going to get the attention of somebody important. His disciples told him, look, don't be messing with those children. Important people were here. And Jesus said words to the effect, these children are very important. Unless you become as little children, you shall in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven. He who offends one of these, my little ones, it were better for him that a millstone be tied around his neck and he be drowned in the depth of the sea. So if I see somebody abusing children, that person bears in my mind what people call the mark of Cain, the mark of one who has not yet done it, but very well may be a murderer. White people create images and symbols to impose on other people, but those things mean nothing to the white creators. These white people in Nebraska have what they call a constitution. Oh, but by the way, while I was growing up, I learned by heart much that's in the Bible. Memorized long passages, not just in the Psalms. Everybody knows the 23rd Psalm. They know of it if they don't know it. But I picked up some principles along the way. And here's something interesting. While these idiot white people who call themselves Christians are banning books because they say they contain sex and so forth, that's good. I wish they could ban all the books and the Bible would be banned. The Bible describes rape, murder, incest. Look up Absalom. He raped his own sister. Some people who study languages look at the part of the scriptures that describe the relationship between David, who became the king, and his good friend Jonathan. The same word that described love between a man and woman was the word love used to describe the relationship between David and Jonathan. But these white people say, well, but that, because they don't want to face this truth. What somebody does in their bedroom is no business of mine. I wouldn't put my ear to anybody's bedroom door, and I wouldn't put my eye to their keyhole, because it's not any of my business. And as I say, they ought to get off crotch watch and mind their own business. But their Constitution is supposed to be the fundamental law of their country when it's the U.S. Constitution, of the state when it's the state. It's the foundation, and everything is erected thereon. The laws are like buildings constructed on that foundation. I wanted that Constitution to be respected, so when senators brought laws, potential laws, I would examine them and I would analyze them, and I would show them that there were parts in it that was unconstitutional and that it should change. Sometimes they accepted it, sometimes they didn't, because they were carrying legislation for lobbyists who paid them, and they were supposed to get it enacted in the way that it was written. So they just had a battle on their hands with me. They brought, in a state like Nebraska, where everybody maybe who's white out in the country got a shotgun and will hunt anything moving. But they wanted to put into the Constitution, because some dumb senator went to Minnesota and saw where they put in their Constitution a provision to protect hunting, trapping, and fishing. They wanted to put it in the Nebraska Constitution. I said, that's stupid. And then with a little research, I saw that somebody had attempted to do it when the U.S. Constitution was being written, and it was ridiculed and laughed. They said, well, I won't go through that. It'll take too much time. But I said, in a state like Nebraska, there will be no laws against hunting, trapping, as cruel as it is, or fishing, as cruel as it is. How would you like somebody to hold your head under the water and not let you breathe? You wouldn't like it, would you? And if you made an inhaling movement or motion, you'd suck water down into your lungs, and if enough got in there, you'd die from suffocation. You don't die from drinking too much water, you die from not getting enough oxygen. What do you think happens to a fish when you take that fish out of the water? When the water passes through the fish's mouth and the gills, it picks up oxygen. In other words, that's the way it breathes. When you take it out of the water, it dies from suffocation. That's why if you drop a fish on the ground, it flops, and people love to watch that. Well, maybe if fish were in charge, they'd love to see you have your head held underwater, and they hold your fish and watch you struggle to try to get air. I thought all these were God's creatures, huh? But anyway, because I'd given an affirmation that I would uphold the Constitution, to me that meant keep it from being minimized, degraded by nonsensical things being put in it. So I fought tooth and nail, and I thought the best way to fight against an amendment like this that they were offering, hunting, trapping, and fishing, I offered amendments of things that should be hunted, things that should be trapped, things that should be fished for. Here was one, and I'm going to read this. Hunting for Amelia Earhart, salvaging the Nebraska Constitution. In 2005, a few years ago, they had a debate on an amendment to propose to the Constitution to prohibit any law that would abolish hunting, trapping, or fishing. So I offered amendments of things that should be hunted for. Excuse me. On April 21st, 2005, during extended legislative debate by which I, for the third time, derailed an ill-advised attempt to befoul the Nebraska Constitution with an amendment to, quote, protect, unquote, hunting, fishing, and trapping. My Amelia Earhart amendment, one of 3 dozen, created the opportunity for me to expound on what I deemed to be a fit target of hunting In other words, this is what you ought to be hunting for. I argued in pertinent point and part, and this is still contained, I'm quoting from the transcript of that debate. Amelia Earhart Amendment. After the word hunting, it adds, for the wreckage of Amelia Earhart's airplane. That would be in the Nebraska Constitution. It would be deemed a valued part of the heritage of the people, because that's what they claimed their amendment to protect hunting would be. Not just of Nebraska, not just of this country, but of people everywhere, to be aware of and to hunt for, or hope that somebody will hunt for and be successful in finding the wreckage of her plane, unquote. Then, after detailing some of her aviation exploits, including crossing the Atlantic alone on May 20th and 21st of 1932, all of which drew her into the movement that encouraged the development of commercial aviation, I took up the thread and described her doomed flight in a twin-engine Lockheed Electra. And I read Greek mythology, and I know a few things. And I recounted the Greek origin of the name Electra and how other planes and ships bearing that name had met with disaster historically, and some people are superstitious. They think the name or the word Electra attached to something dooms it. In many cases, things happen to be doomed that had that name. The significance of a successful hunt for Amelia. I said, because of what this woman achieved, and because of the fact that human beings, especially in places like America, relate more to physical objects than to the idea behind them, if the wreckage of this woman's plane were to be found and established conclusively to be the wreckage of her plane, it could become somewhat of a shrine. Old women who were denied opportunities to do the things that they knew they had the ability to do, but were denied the opportunity because of their gender. Middle-aged women who were disheartened because the ones who went before them had done things so they felt doomed to follow the same drudge path. And young women who, because they still have a degree of rebelliousness and unwillingness to be roped in and tamed and made to feel that they've got to live as somebody else has lived just because they did it, all of these categories of women, old, middle-aged, and young, could go to that shrine. They could, and this is direct quotes from the transcript that will be a part of Nebraska history as long as there is a legislature. They could span the generations and realize that this huge female pool of talent and ability is exemplified by what this woman had done and lost her life apparently in trying to do more. The wreckage of this airplane would prove that that had really happened. So all of the women of whatever religion, political persuasion, race, language group, ethnicity, sexual orientation, if some people knew that Willa Cather, a famous literary person in Nebraska, wrote My Antonia and some other things, if some people knew that Willa Cather was a lesbian, they'd be wanting to take her out of the Nebraska Hall of Fame. That's why I said sexual orientation. All of these women could go there. They could light candles. They could write notes and leave them there. They could bring dolls, bouquets of flowers, articles of clothing, pieces of jewelry, anything that they felt they wanted to leave at that shrine to recognize and acknowledge what this woman had done, and to try to keep alive the spirit that she manifested, and walk away from there refreshed in their own spirit, stirred in their minds, inspired in their hearts, and determined to show what women as a united force can do, unquote. Then altering the course of history, quoting again from the transcript, comprising a majority of the population of this country. There is no reason why women cannot seize political power and change this country. And by changing the most powerful country in the world, change the entire world. And by changing the world, alter the course of history. And it would be altered for the better, because it cannot be any worse than it is now under the dominance of white men. Amelia Earhart is somebody who ought to be remembered. And what I'm offering here is far less frivolous, it's even whimsical, than what the original proposed constitutional amendment suggests. So I hope you'll adopt my amendment. Thank you, Mr. President. This is not in the transcript, but it's describing what happened. Before requesting and receiving support in rejecting my amendment, the sponsor of the proposed constitutional amendment offered an acknowledgement, as often happened despite opposition to my offerings. Mr. President, and this is in the transcript, Mr. President, members of the legislature, first of all, I commend Senator Chambers for bringing this and talking about all the wonderful things about Amelia Earhart. And she was more of my parents' generation. Although that's the case, I can remember growing up, them talking about her and how the plane wreck was, she was never found again. But I'm going to oppose this, meaning my amendment. I don't think it's appropriate subject matter to be part of this proposal, but it would be better than what they were offering. Now, 7 years later, July 23rd, 2012, this is what was written by the Omaha World Herald, and it carried an Associated Press article headline, Earhart Mystery End, near end with a question mark. The caption under an accompanying photo says, quote, underwater robot will aid hunt for Amelia Earhart's plane. The piece details a $2.2 million expedition to a remote island in the Pacific nation of Kiribati, quote, where they hope to find the wreckage of her Lockheed Electra, unquote, in nearby waters. She went missing in an attempted around-the-world flight in 1937 with her navigator, Fred Noonan. In January 1935, she was the first person to make a solo flight from Hawaii to California. Previous attempts by male pilots all ended in disaster. On April 21st, 2005, I gave that extended debate. And what the World Herald had written was about the attempt to recover the wreckage of Amelia Earhart's plane. That was 7 years after I had offered my amendment. Now, I'm going to go to what I call the queen of all that I've said. It happens that she's a black woman. Her name, Harriet Tubman. There is an outfit called the Bradford Exchange Mint, and they minted a silver coin to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Harriet's death. When Harriet Tubman decided to risk everything for freedom, she may not have been aware of Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, but she knew the truth of it in her own heart and her everyday life. She later said to her biographer, quote, "Slavery is the next thing to hell," unquote, and, quote, "I had reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." That's what she said. Now, let me give you what Patrick Henry said in 1775. a good number of years before Harriet was born. And he was talking about the British coming because Patrick Henry himself was a slaveholder who fathered children on black women by rape. And by doing that, he was unfaithful to his wife, so it was adultery. But he is a white American hero. And this is what Patrick Henry said in his speech before the Virginia Convention in Richmond, March 23, 1775. It is vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. The gentleman may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears a clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that the gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? He didn't say this. Like we keep black people in? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. She knew that those were the two alternatives that slavery allowed her. If I could not have one, I'd have the other. Her daring escape from Maryland's eastern shore in 1849 was just the first of her many exploits. After gaining her freedom, she was determined to free as many others as she could. Tubman earned the nickname Moses after the biblical prophet Moses, who led his people to freedom. She made at least 13 journeys back to the South to free members of her family, as well as dozens of others. In all of her journeys as a good conductor on the Underground Railroad, she proudly said she never lost a single passenger. With the outbreak of the Civil War, Tubman viewed a Union victory as the best way to free more slaves. Therefore, she served with Union forces as a nurse, scout, and spy. Following emancipation, she continued to work for equal rights, including women's suffrage, which did not occur until the adoption of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Born a slave, she has become a shining example of how much Americans have always valued freedom and gave themselves to achieve it. Harriet Tubman's decision to escape slavery was not an easy one. As much as she hated her slave status, leaving meant abandoning her family, her home, and everything familiar. She knew she risked losing her life or being enslaved in even worse circumstances. Yet in 1849, she was determined to risk everything for freedom. She escaped from Maryland with the aid of the Underground Railroad, which was a network of abolitionists and free African Americans who helped fugitive slaves to escape to free territories. Traveling mostly by night, guided by the North Star, she probably followed a common route for escaping slaves along the Choptank River through Delaware and then north into Pennsylvania to Philadelphia. The 90-mile journey on foot could have taken her between 5 days and 3 weeks. Traveling across unfamiliar territory and treacherous waterways in the dark, she also had to hide from slave catchers seeking rewards for fugitive slaves. Once she made it to freedom, she committed herself to working to abolish slavery and to save as many lives as she could. She made an additional 13 journeys back into the South, rescuing many of her family and dozens of other enslaved people, and became known as Moses. When she joined the Union Army, she became a spy. And here is what was said about her. Still another efficient spy was Harriet Tubman. She was an escaped slave and one of the most daring of all. Before the war, she aided slaves to escape. T.W. Higginson, white colonel of a Negro regiment, said of her, "We have here the greatest heroine of the age, Harriet Tubman, a black woman and a fugitive slave. Her tales of adventure are beyond anything in fiction, and her ingenuity and generalship are extraordinary. She had a reward of $12,000 offered for her in Maryland and will probably be burnt alive whenever she is caught, which she will probably be, first or last, as she is going again and again. She is jet black and cannot read or write. only talk besides acting. Wendell Phillips, he was a great, well-known abolitionist. Wendell Phillips, in an outburst of admiration, called her, quote, the best and bravest person on this continent. Then General Sexton, to whom she gave valuable information, praised her zeal and courage. When she died in 1913 at the age of 80, she was given a military funeral. How many people knew that about Harriet Tubman? And these are things that these white people who hate CRT, critical race theory, don't want in the textbooks because they say it makes little children feel bad. Now, I'm not an artist. I'm a drawer. And I made a sketch. There's a guy named Billy Joel I like his singing. He sang a song called Piano Man. He said this guy he played the piano and these people came around him. And one guy came to him and said, play me a song, something. Play me the song, tune of a melody. I can't really call how it goes, but it's sad and it's sweet, and I knew it complete when I wore a younger man's clothes. I drew this when I wore a younger man's clothes. You probably cannot see it well, but that was my vision of what Harriet Tubman would have been like. And they said there was one time they were on one of the journeys back, and this brother got tired. Feet were hurting, and he was scared because it was now night, and sometimes they could hear hounds baying, and they didn't know whether they were barking because they're out hunting or they were on their trail. So he said, Sister Harriet, I can't go on. I got to go back. She said, you will not go back. You will go on. He said, but Sister Harriet, I can't go back. She reached inside this long garment that she was wearing, reached inside and pulled out a pistol with a barrel that long. And to this brother, the opening in the barrel looked that big. And she put it against his nose. She said, you gonna be free or you gonna be dead? He said, Sister Harriet, I think I'm gonna be free. And that's what happened. He wound up reaching freedom. There are so many things about our people that have been kept from us, that will be kept from us, that we need to speak out. And when I was in the legislature, I constantly gave them lessons in history, constantly talked about black people who had done great things and not been acknowledged, talked about white people who worked with black people who even during those days, they ran a risk by associating in such a way. But even with all of that, there were some white men and white women who joined us in our struggle. So we, who are the most oppressed people in this country, the most oppressed who have ever been in this country, have to realize that as much as white people in general might have contempt for us and mistreat us, we still have to find it in ourselves to judge each person individually and treat them based on how they deal with us. So I keep an open mind toward everybody. Nobody can treat me better than I will treat them. But I say this for us, white people in general dislike and will discriminate against us in general. If such were not the case, all of the barriers based on race would be eliminated. That's not going to happen during my lifetime. I've only got a few days left, not 24-hour days, but I could have just a few 60-minute hours left or 60-second minutes left for all I know. But they say in the Bible, the years of a man's life are 70. A score is 20 years. 3 times 20 is 60 plus 10 is 70. I'm 86, so I'm living on borrowed time, or I'm living on time that somebody who died ahead of time left to me. The fact is that I'm breathing, I'm living, I'm conscious. And the reason I worked so hard when I was in the legislature, to help other people regardless of race, religion, sexual orientation, or anything else. I am the most selfish person in the world. I am extremely uncomfortable when I'm in the presence of somebody suffering unmerited harm. So, with all due respect to that person who's being harmed, my selfishness impels me, in order that I might have peace of mind, to help that person. So I help the least, the last, and the lost. Not to be noble, not to be praised, but for my own peace of mind's sake. But for those out there who need something else, if you claim to be a Christian based on what that supposedly means, and you believe what's in the Bible, you claim to, what about love your neighbor as yourself? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What about all of those things? But instead there's whooping, there's hollering, there are cutthroat preachers who will filch money from the widows, who will take food from the orphans, so to speak, and not be an example of what it is they preach. I may not be a good example in some people's mind, but other people's judgment doesn't mean anything to me. I have one true friend, and that friend is deep down inside of me. And that friend knows me like nobody else does. I can't pull the wool over his eyes. I can't trick him. And the only time I can lay my head on my pillow at night and sleep the sleep of the just is when that friend deep down inside of me says, you traveled all those miles before you slept. You had promises to keep, and those promises you kept. Therefore, I will let you have a peaceful night's sleep. The world is not going to change itself. Now, I'm not saying this next just because I'm old. We need to be concerned and show care for our elderly people among us when it comes to their health, their physical well-being. Dementia is one of the most cruel things, I think, that can befall somebody. Forgetfulness, to not know who you are, not know where you are, maybe not know what this is, or if you know what it is, you no longer remember what it's for. Imagine if you have just enough awareness to be aware of how forgetful you're becoming. Can I say that I'm not forgetting things? Absolutely not. I wish I could remember everything that ever entered my mind from the time I was conscious. Now, sometimes I can remember long stretches of poetry. My favorite is The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Just a verse. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many quaint and curious volumes of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I sought to borrow from my book's surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore she had died. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. so that now to stop the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, 'tis some visitor entreating entry at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entry at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. Then he goes on, and then he says such and such. Then he says, open here, I flung the shutter. Then with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, that mean bowing and scraping. Not a moment stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon the bust of Pallas, one of those old gods, perched upon the bust of Pallas, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then you have to go on, and then you ask this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore. But then the famous word, quoth the raven, nevermore. And it goes on for 20-something stanzas. I used to know every one of them. When I wore a younger man's clothes. But I wasn't quoting it all the time like I was in those days either. I even liked some of the poetry of one of the biggest racists of all time, Rudyard Kipling. A racist. But he did have the, if you want to call it decency, to respect and acknowledge in other people who were of inferior groups, those occasional noble ones, who show that there is a spark of dignity in every group. And he may have had a struggle within himself, but down through history, the British people have tried to determine who they think the greatest writer of all time among themselves would be. And guess who that rascal was? Rudyard Kipling, who said, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it up on you, I finish that, you must be the executioner. I think that my time is up, and I don't want to take that which does not belong to me. So I'm going to say so long until the next time.
You've been watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to leave suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This is an EWC Communications production.